The summer of 1995 hung heavy over Millbrook County like a wool blanket, the kind of oppressive heat that made the asphalt shimmer and turned car seats into furnaces. The annual county fair had transformed the usually quiet fairgrounds into a bustling carnival of lights, laughter, and the sweet scent of cotton candy mingling with diesel fumes from the generators powering the rides. 7-year-old Ethan Riley pressed his small face against the chain-link fence, watching the Ferris wheel turn slowly against the cloudless blue sky. His freckled nose was already pink from the sun, and his sandy hair stuck to his forehead with perspiration. The red balloon tied to his wrist bobbed in the barely perceptible breeze as he tugged on his mother's sundress. "Mum, can we go on the tilt-a-whirl next?" Ethan's voice carried that particular pitch of childhood excitement that could cut through any crowd noise. Sarah Riley smiled down at her son, her heart warm with the simple joy of watching him experience the magic of the fair. At 32, she still felt young enough to remember her own childhood summers at this very same fair, back when her biggest worry was whether she'd have enough tickets for one more ride. Now, watching Ethan's eyes light up at every colourful booth and spinning ride, she felt that same wonder reflected back at her. Before you continue watching, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps the channel grow. Now back to our story. "Of course, sweetie," Sarah said, checking her watch. It was just past 3 o'clock, and they still had plenty of time before meeting David back at the car. Her husband had wandered off to examine some antique farm equipment with the focused intensity he reserved for anything with an engine. "But let's get some lemonade first. You look like you're melting." The fairgrounds stretched out before them like a small temporary city, complete with its own geography of wonders. The midway formed the main street, lined with game booths where barkers called out promises of giant stuffed animals and impossible-to-win prizes. Beyond that, the food vendors had set up their trailers in neat rows, sending up clouds of aromatic smoke from funnel cake fryers and barbecue grills. The rides occupied the far end of the grounds, their mechanical symphony of whirs, clicks, and musical themes, creating a soundtrack that would echo in visitors' memories long after they'd gone home. Ethan skipped alongside his mother, his sneakers kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The red balloon followed obediently above him, a bright beacon in the crowd. Sarah kept one eye on her son and another on the flow of people around them. Families like theirs, teenagers in groups, elderly couples walking slowly hand in hand, all united in their pursuit of simple summer pleasures. The lemonade stand was operated by the local 4-H club, a group of earnest teenagers who had clearly been working in the heat all day. Their faces were flushed and their matching green t-shirts showed the evidence of their labor, but they maintained cheerful smiles as they squeezed fresh lemons and added ice to tall plastic cups. "2 large lemonades, please," Sarah said, reaching into her purse for her wallet. While his mother counted out bills, Ethan wandered a few steps away, fascinated by a nearby booth where a man in a red-striped vest was guessing people's weights. The carnival worker had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years traveling from fair to fair, his hands quick and sure as he sized up potential customers. There was something mesmerizing about the way he could look at a person and confidently announce their weight within a few pounds, winning more often than he lost. "If I guess wrong, you win the big prize," the man called out in a voice roughened by years of shouting over crowd noise. "Step right up and test my skills." Ethan watched as a heavy-set man in overalls stepped onto the scale, clearly confident that he'd stump the weight guesser. The carnival worker studied him for a moment, his eyes narrow with concentration, then announced, 237 pounds. The scale settled at 239 pounds, and the crowd that had gathered around the booth groaned in disappointment as the man walked away empty-handed. But Ethan was fascinated by the near accuracy of the guess, the way the carnival worker had been able to read something invisible to everyone else. "Ethan, here's your lemonade," Sarah called, turning from the 4-H stand with 2 sweating cups in her hands. But when she looked toward where her son had been standing just moments before, she saw only the crowd of fairgoers, their faces unfamiliar and indifferent. The red balloon was nowhere to be seen among the sea of heads and shoulders. "Ethan," Sarah's voice carried a note of concern, though not yet panic. Children wandered at fairs. It was practically a rite of passage. She took a few steps in the direction of the weight-guessing booth, scanning the crowd with the methodical intensity of a mother's trained eye. "Ethan," this time her voice was louder, carrying over the ambient noise of the fair. A few people glanced in her direction, but their expressions showed only mild curiosity before they returned to their own activities. The lemonade cups grew slippery in Sarah's increasingly sweaty palms as she began to move more quickly through the crowd, her head turning left and right in sharp, jerky movements. The fairgrounds that had seemed magical just minutes before now felt like a maze designed to swallow children whole. The first 15 minutes of searching felt like hours to Sarah Riley. She moved through the fairgrounds with increasing desperation, calling Ethan's name until her voice began to crack. The red balloon that had been her son's constant companion was nowhere to be seen, as if it had simply vanished into the cloudless sky above. "Excuse me?" Sarah approached a woman manning a ring toss game, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Have you seen a little boy, about 7 years old, sandy hair, wearing a blue t-shirt with a dinosaur on it?" The woman, whose name tag read Betty, looked up from arranging plastic rings with the kind of patient expression that suggested she'd been asked similar questions many times before. "Honey, I see dozens of kids matching that description every day. When did you last see him?" "Just a few minutes ago, right over by the lemonade stand." Sarah pointed across the midway, though the gesture felt futile. "He was watching the weight-guessing booth, and then—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would make Ethan's disappearance feel real. Betty's expression softened as she recognized the familiar progression from concern to fear that she'd witnessed in other parents over the years. "Have you checked the bathrooms? Kids that age, sometimes they just wander off when nature calls and forget to tell Mom and Dad." Sarah nodded quickly, grasping at this perfectly reasonable explanation. "Yes, that must be it. Thank you." She hurried toward the portable facilities set up near the food vendors, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. The men's restroom yielded nothing but confused looks from fathers helping their own small sons. The women's restroom was empty, except for a teenage girl reapplying lipstick in the mirror. Sarah even checked the family restroom, knocking tentatively on the locked door until a voice called out that they'd be just a minute. When the door opened to reveal a mother with twin toddlers, Sarah's last reasonable hope evaporated. She found herself standing in the center of the fairgrounds, turning in slow circles as if she might spot Ethan simply by changing her angle of view. The crowd seemed to pulse around her, a living organism of which she was no longer truly a part. Families walked by laughing and chatting, their children safely in tow, and Sarah felt a growing disconnection from their carefree world. "Sarah!" David's voice cut through the ambient noise like a lifeline. She turned to see her husband jogging toward her, his face flushed from the heat and exertion. At 35, David Riley still carried himself like the high school football player he'd once been, though his dark hair was beginning to thin at the temples and his frame had softened with the comfort of marriage and regular meals. "David, thank God!" Sarah rushed to meet him, her words tumbling out in a breathless stream. "I can't find Ethan. We were getting lemonade, and he was right there watching the weight-guessing booth. And then he's gone, David. I've looked everywhere." David's expression shifted from confusion to concern as he processed his wife's words. His engineering mind immediately began working the problem, organizing the search into manageable components. Okay, slow down. How long has he been missing? 20 minutes, maybe 25. Sarah's voice cracked on the numbers. In the context of their normal family routine, 25 minutes was nothing. The time it took to drive to the grocery store or for Ethan to get distracted by his toys and forget to come downstairs for dinner. But here, in this temporary city of strangers, 25 minutes felt like an eternity. "All right, that's not long," David said, though his own voice carried a note of forced calm. "Kids get distracted at fairs. He probably saw something interesting and followed it. Let's split up and cover more ground systematically." They established a simple grid system, with David taking the rides and games on the north side of the fairgrounds, while Sarah covered the south side and the food vendors. They would meet back at the lemonade stand in 15 minutes, and if they still hadn't found Ethan, they would contact security. David moved through his assigned area with mechanical precision, checking behind every booth and game, asking every vendor the same questions Sarah had asked. The carnival workers were uniformly helpful but unhelpful. They'd seen dozens of boys matching Ethan's description, but none remembered one specific child clearly enough to provide useful information. At the tilt-a-whirl, the ride Ethan had been so excited to try, David watched car after car spin past, filled with laughing children and nervous parents. None of the faces belonged to his son. The ride operator, a young man with multiple piercings and arms covered in tattoos, shook his head when David described Ethan. "Sorry, man. I see a lot of kids, you know. They kind of blur together after a while." The operator's tone was genuinely apologetic, but his words hit David like a physical blow. The idea that his unique, irreplaceable son could blur together with anonymous children felt like a betrayal of everything that made Ethan special. Meanwhile, Sarah had expanded her search beyond the food vendors to include the livestock barns, thinking that Ethan might have been drawn to see the animals. The barns were cooler than the open fairgrounds, filled with the earthy smells of hay and livestock. Families moved slowly through the aisles, children pressing their faces to pen railings to get better looks at the prize-winning cattle, sheep, and pigs. "Ethan!" Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. A few people turned to look at her, their expressions showing mild concern, but no familiar face appeared from behind the animal pens. An elderly man in overalls and a feed store cap approached her with the slow, careful gait of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with animals. "You looking for someone, miss?" "My son," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. 7 years old, sandy hair, blue dinosaur shirt. Have you seen him?" The man considered this seriously, his weathered face creasing with concentration. "Can't say that I have, but I've been mostly focused on the cattle judging. You might want to check with Sheriff Morrison. He's been making rounds, and he's got a good eye for keeping track of kids." Sheriff Morrison. The suggestion felt both hopeful and terrifying. Involving law enforcement would make Ethan's disappearance official, would transform it from a temporary inconvenience into something more serious. But it also meant bringing professional help into their search, resources that Sarah and David didn't have on their own. When they reconvened at the lemonade stand 15 minutes later, both Sarah and David wore the same expression of frustrated defeat. The 4-H teenagers manning the stand looked at them with sympathy, having clearly noticed the increasingly frantic woman who'd been asking about her missing son. "We need to find security," David said, his engineer's mind having reached the inevitable conclusion. "This isn't just a kid wandering off anymore. Sheriff Tom Morrison had been working the county fair for over 15 years, and in that time he'd handled his share of missing children. Most were found within 30 minutes, discovered hiding under a ride platform or having wandered into the wrong bathroom. A few took longer, usually because they'd fallen asleep in some quiet corner or had been distracted by an animal in the livestock barns. But as he walked toward the increasingly distraught couple standing by the lemonade stand, something in their body language told him this might be different. Morrison was a big man, standing 6'4", with the kind of solid build that came from farm work in his youth and careful attention to fitness in his middle age. At 48, he'd been sheriff of Millbrook County for 8 years, elected on a platform of community-focused policing and personal accountability. His graying mustache and calm demeanor had a way of settling anxious citizens, but the Riley case would test that reputation in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Mr. and Mrs. Riley? Morrison approached with his notebook already in hand, his voice carrying the professional calm that came from years of experience. "I understand you're looking for your son." Sarah nodded quickly, her hands twisting around the strap of her purse. "Ethan. He's 7, and he's been missing for almost an hour now. We've looked everywhere." "All right, let's start from the beginning," Morrison said, guiding them to a slightly quieter area near the edge of the fairgrounds. "I want you to tell me exactly what happened, step by step. Don't leave out any details, even if they seem unimportant." David cleared his throat and began the story, his engineering background showing in the methodical way he recounted the events. Sarah filled in details about Ethan's clothing, his red balloon, and his fascination with the weight-guessing booth. As they talked, Morrison took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "The weight-guessing booth," Morrison said, tapping his pen against his notebook. "That's run by a man named Eddie Carver. He's been traveling the fair circuit for about 10 years. Good reputation, no troubles that I know of. But let's go talk to him." They found Eddie Carver cleaning up around his booth, preparing for the evening crowd. He was a thin man in his 50s, with the kind of deep tan that came from spending most of his life outdoors. His red-striped vest was faded but clean, and his manner was respectful when Morrison introduced himself. "Sheriff," Eddie nodded, setting down the stuffed animals he'd been rearranging. "What can I do for you?" "These folks are looking for their son. 7 years old, sandy hair, blue shirt with a dinosaur. Mrs. Riley says he was watching your booth earlier this afternoon, around 3:15 or so." Eddie's weathered face creased with concentration. "Yeah, I remember him. Cute kid, really interested in how I could guess people's weights. He hung around for maybe 10 minutes watching me work." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "His mum called for him, and when he didn't answer right away, I figured he'd just wandered off like kids do." "You saw him leave?" Morrison asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "Well, not exactly leave," Eddie said slowly. "I was focused on a customer, trying to guess this big fellow's weight. When I looked up again, the kid was gone. I assumed he'd gone back to his parents." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "But I called for him. I was right there by the lemonade stand, maybe 30 feet away. He would have heard me." Eddie shrugged apologetically. "It gets pretty noisy around here, Mum. Music from the rides, people talking, generators running. Sometimes kids just don't hear, you know, or they get distracted by something more interesting." Morrison made more notes, then looked up at the carnival worker. "Did you notice anyone else paying particular attention to the boy? Anyone who seemed out of place or overly interested in children?" This was the question that transformed the afternoon from a search and rescue operation into something more serious. Eddie considered it carefully, his expression growing more concerned. "Well, there was this one guy," Eddie said slowly. "Middle-aged fellow, maybe 45 or 50. He wasn't playing games or riding rides, just sort of walking around, watching people. He stopped near my booth for a while, but he wasn't watching me work. He seemed more interested in the families, especially the kids." Sarah grabbed David's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "What did he look like?" "Average height, brown hair starting to go grey, wearing jeans and a plaid shirt, nothing that would make him stand out. But there was something about the way he moved, you know. like he was looking for something specific. Morrison's expression had grown considerably more serious. "Did you see this man interact with the Riley boy at all?" "Not directly, no. But he was hanging around the area for a while, maybe 20 or 30 minutes, and—" Eddie paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. "And what?" David pressed. "Well, I noticed he left around the same time the boy disappeared. Could be a coincidence, but it stuck with me because he'd been there so long without actually doing anything." Morrison closed his notebook with a snap that sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over their small group. "I'm going to radio for additional units and start a more systematic search. Mr. and Mrs. Riley, I need you to stay near the information booth so we can find you easily. We're also going to need a recent photograph of Ethan." The next hour transformed the county fair from a place of family entertainment into the center of an intensive search operation. Additional sheriff's deputies arrived, along with volunteers from the local fire department and search and rescue teams from neighboring counties. The fairgrounds were divided into sections, with teams assigned to search each area thoroughly. As evening approached and the golden light of late afternoon began to fade, the reality of the situation settled over the Riley family like a cold fog. David stood with his arm around Sarah's shoulders, both of them watching as uniformed officers questioned carnival workers and searched behind every booth and trailer. Sarah clutched a school photo of Ethan in her hand, his gap-toothed smile and bright eyes looking up at her from the glossy paper. It had been taken just 3 months earlier, and she remembered how proud he'd been of his new haircut and the dinosaur shirt he'd insisted on wearing for picture day. "We'll find him," David said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Kids don't just disappear." But even as he spoke the words, David could feel them losing their power. Children did disappear, sometimes without a trace, sometimes forever. The statistics were terrible and real, and no amount of wishful thinking could change them. As the sun began to set over Millbrook County, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that should have been beautiful, Sarah Riley held her son's photograph and tried to believe that somewhere in the growing darkness, Ethan was safe and waiting to come home. 28 years later, March 2023, Detective Marcus Webb had been retired from the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department for exactly 18 months, but the Ethan Riley case still haunted his dreams. At 62, Webb had closed more cases than any other detective in the county's history, but the one that got away continued to gnaw at him like an old injury that ached before storms. Webb's retirement had been comfortable, if not luxurious. His pension provided enough for the small house he'd bought on the outskirts of town, complete with a workshop where he could indulge his newfound hobby of woodworking. But between crafting coffee tables and birdhouses, his mind inevitably drifted back to that summer day in 1995, when a 7-year-old boy had vanished without a trace. He was sanding the legs of a dining room chair when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Webb," he answered, his voice carrying the professional tone that 28 years in law enforcement had made automatic. "Detective Webb, this is Jenny Martinez from the Millbrook Gazette. I know you're retired, but I'm working on a story about cold cases, and I wondered if you might have time to discuss the Ethan Riley disappearance." Webb set down his sandpaper and walked to the window overlooking his backyard. A cardinal was perched on the bird feeder he'd built the previous month, its red plumage bright against the grey March sky. "That's a name I haven't heard in a while. What's the angle for your story?" "Well, that's the interesting part," Jenny said, her voice carrying the excitement of a reporter who'd stumbled onto something significant. "Someone posted a photograph on social media yesterday, Reddit specifically, claiming it shows Ethan Riley as an adult. The post has gone viral, and people are saying the resemblance is uncanny." Webb felt his pulse quicken. Over the years, there had been dozens of false leads, supposed sightings, and hoax photographs. Each one had been investigated thoroughly and had led nowhere, but something in the reporter's voice suggested this might be different. "Have you seen the photograph?" Webb asked. "I have. And Detective, I've been covering crime in this county for 8 years, and I've seen the missing person files. This man in the photograph, he looks exactly like what you'd expect Ethan Riley to look like as a 35-year-old adult." Webb was already reaching for his car keys. "Where can I see this photograph?" "I can email you the link, but you might want to prepare yourself. It's unsettling how much he resembles the age progression images that were created over the years." 20 minutes later, Webb sat in his truck in the parking lot of the Millbrook Public Library, staring at his phone screen. The photograph showed a man standing in what appeared to be a busy urban environment, possibly New York or Chicago, based on the architecture visible in the background. He was approximately 35 years old, with sandy hair that showed the same cowlick that had been prominent in Ethan's childhood photos. His facial structure carried the mature version of the bone structure that had characterized the missing boy, but it was the eyes that made Webb's breath catch in his throat. They were the same pale blue that had stared out from missing person posters for nearly 3 decades, with the same slightly downturned shape that had made Ethan's expression perpetually thoughtful, even as a child. Webb called the number he still had memorized after all these years. "Riley Residence," Sarah answered, her voice carrying the weary note that had characterized it since that terrible day at the county fair. "Sarah, this is Marcus Webb. I know it's been a while, but I need you to see something." Sarah Riley was now 59 years old, her hair more grey than brown, and her face lined with the kind of premature aging that comes from carrying an unbearable burden. She and David had divorced 12 years after Ethan's disappearance, their marriage unable to survive the constant stress of not knowing what had happened to their son. David had remarried and moved to Arizona, starting a new family that included 2 daughters who had never known they had a half-brother who might or might not still be alive. Sarah lived alone in a small apartment across town from the house where she and David had raised Ethan for his brief 7 years. The apartment was filled with photographs of her son, tracking his growth from infancy through that last school picture taken 3 months before he vanished. The walls also displayed the age progression images that had been created over the years, showing what Ethan might look like at 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30. When Webb showed her the photograph on his phone, Sarah's hands began to shake. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh my God, that's him. That's my baby." Webb studied her reaction carefully. "Sarah, I need you to be absolutely certain. This could be a cruel coincidence, or someone playing a sick joke. I don't want to put you through false hope." But Sarah was already reaching for the framed age progression image on her coffee table, the one showing what Ethan might look like at 35. The similarities were unmistakable. The shape of the nose, the set of the ears, the distinctive way his hair grew at the temples. "Marcus, I carried this child for 9 months and raised him for 7 years. I know every line of his face, every expression he was capable of making. This is Ethan. I don't know how or where or why, but this is my son." Webb nodded slowly, his detective's mind already working through the implications. "I need to make some calls. The original case was never officially closed, just moved to inactive status. If this really is Ethan, then we need to find out where this photograph was taken and when." The Reddit post had been made by a user with the handle StreetPhotographer23, who claimed to have taken the picture while doing documentary photography in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. The timestamp on the post showed it had been uploaded just 2 days earlier, and the accompanying text was brief. "Interesting face in the crowd. Something about this guy reminded me of those missing person posters you see sometimes. Within hours of the post going viral, internet sleuths had made the connection to the Ethan Riley case. The comments section was filled with side-by-side comparisons of the photograph and Ethan's childhood pictures, along with increasingly elaborate theories about what might have happened to him. Webb spent the afternoon making phone calls to contacts in the Chicago Police Department, trying to track down the photographer and get more information about when and where the picture had been taken. The process was frustrating and slow, complicated by the fact that he was no longer an active law enforcement officer and had no official standing to request information. But by evening, he had managed to identify the photographer as Michael Chen, a freelance photojournalist who specialized in urban documentary work. Chen confirmed that he had taken the photograph 3 weeks earlier while working on a project about gentrification in Chicago neighborhoods. "The guy was just walking down the street," Chen explained over the phone. "Nothing unusual about him, but he had one of those faces that catches your eye, you know. Good bone structure, interesting expression. I took maybe 5 or 6 shots as he passed by, just part of the background for my larger project." "Did you interact with him at all?" Webb asked. "Get his name or see where he went?" "No, nothing like that. He was just part of the crowd. But I can tell you exactly where I took the picture. Lincoln Avenue, just north of Fullerton. There are several apartment buildings in that area, along with shops and restaurants. If he lives in the neighborhood, someone might recognize him." As Webb hung up the phone, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had characterized the best moments of his career as a detective. For the first time in 28 years, they had a concrete lead in the Ethan Riley case. It might lead nowhere, as so many leads had before, but it was something tangible to investigate. He called Sarah back to update her on what he'd learned, and he could hear the hope in her voice warring with the caution that came from years of disappointment. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now I take a trip to Chicago," Webb said, "and we find out if this really is your son, and if it is, what happened to him all those years ago." The Greyhound bus from Millbrook to Chicago took 6 hours, giving Marcus Webb plenty of time to review the case files he'd brought with him. Even in retirement, he maintained copies of all the important documents from the Ethan Riley investigation, organized in manila folders that had grown thick with reports, witness statements, and dead-end leads accumulated over nearly 3 decades. As the bus rolled through the flat farmland of Illinois, Webb spread the files across the empty seat beside him and tried to approach the case with fresh eyes. The original investigation had been thorough by small-town standards, but looking back with the perspective of years, he could see gaps that might have been filled with more resources or more sophisticated investigative techniques. The mysterious man Eddie Carver had described, middle-aged, brown hair going grey, hanging around the fairgrounds without participating in activities, had never been identified despite an extensive canvassing effort. Webb had always suspected this individual was key to understanding what had happened to Ethan, but without a name or clear description, the lead had eventually gone cold. There had been other suspects over the years. A registered sex offender who had been in the area that day but had an alibi, a carnival worker who had left town immediately after the fair but was later found working at another event 3 states away, even a troubled teenager who had seemed to know more than he was telling but had passed a polygraph test. All had been investigated and cleared, leaving the case as mysterious as ever. But now, if the photograph really did show Ethan Riley as an adult, it suggested a possibility that Webb had rarely allowed himself to consider, that the boy had somehow survived his disappearance and was living somewhere, possibly unaware of the search that had continued for decades. The bus arrived at Chicago's Union Station just before 6 p.m., and Webb made his way through the evening crowds to catch the L train toward Lincoln Park. He had booked a room at a modest hotel near the area where the photograph had been taken, planning to spend the next few days systematically canvassing the neighborhood. Chicago in March was cold and windy, with the kind of lake-effect weather that cut through clothing and made every step feel like a battle. Webb pulled his coat tighter as he emerged from the Fullerton station and began walking toward Lincoln Avenue. The photographer, Michael Chen, had agreed to meet him at the exact location where the picture had been taken. Chen was a thin man in his 30s, with the kind of intense energy that Webb associated with journalists and artists. He carried an expensive camera and moved with the quick, alert manner of someone always looking for the next shot. "Detective Webb," Chen approached with his hand extended. "Michael Chen, thanks for coming all this way." "Just Webb now," the retired detective corrected. "I'm not official anymore, but I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." Chen led him to a spot on the sidewalk in front of a coffee shop called The Grind. The street was busy with evening foot traffic, people heading home from work, students from nearby DePaul University, residents walking dogs or running errands. "This is where I was standing when I took the photo," Chen said, holding up his camera and pointing it down the street. The subject was walking north, coming from that direction. He indicated a stretch of Lincoln Avenue lined with a mix of apartment buildings, small businesses and restaurants. Webb studied the surroundings carefully, his detective's eye cataloging details. What time of day was this? Around 2:30 in the afternoon. Good light, lots of people moving around. Perfect for street photography. "And you're certain about the date?" "Absolutely. I keep detailed records of all my shoots." Chen pulled out his phone and showed Webb a digital calendar. "March 8th, 2023. I was here for about 3 hours, working on a series about neighborhood changes in Lincoln Park." Webb made notes in the small notebook he'd carried throughout his career. "Did you notice anything else about the man? How he was dressed, where he might have been going?" "Casual clothes, jeans, dark jacket. Nothing that stood out. He moved like someone who knew the area, not like a tourist. Confident, purposeful stride." Chen paused, considering. "Actually, now that I think about it, he went into that building there." He pointed to a 4-story brick apartment building about half a block away. Webb felt his pulse quicken. "You saw him go inside?" "Yeah, I kept shooting for maybe another 10 minutes after I got his picture, and I saw him approach the building and use what looked like a key. Definitely not just visiting. He lives there, or at least has regular access." This was the first concrete lead Webb had encountered in years. He thanked Chen and made his way toward the apartment building, a converted brownstone that looked like it dated from the early 1900s. The front entrance had a security door with an intercom system listing 12 apartments. Webb studied the names on the directory, looking for anything that might connect to Ethan Riley. Most were obviously Hispanic or Eastern European surnames, reflecting the neighborhood's demographic diversity. But one name caught his attention: E. Mitchell, apartment 4B. E. Mitchell. Could E stand for Ethan? Webb pressed the button for the building manager, listed as residing in 1A. After a few moments, a woman's voice crackled through the intercom. "Yeah. Ma'am, my name is Marcus Webb. I'm a retired police detective, and I'm investigating a missing person case. I wonder if I could speak with you for a few minutes." There was a long pause before the woman responded. "What kind of missing person case?" "A child who disappeared 28 years ago. I have reason to believe he might be living in this building now, as an adult." Another pause, then the sound of the security door buzzing open. The building manager was a woman in her 50s named Rosa Delgado, who had the kind of wary expression that came from years of dealing with tenant problems and city bureaucracy. She met Webb in the small lobby, her arms crossed defensively. "You said you're retired?" she asked, studying his identification carefully. "Yes, ma'am. This is a personal investigation. The missing child's mother asked me to follow up on a new lead." Webb showed her the photograph on his phone. "Do you recognize this man?" Rosa looked at the image carefully, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's Eddie. Eddie Mitchell from 4B. Quiet guy, keeps to himself. Been living here for about 3 years. Webb's heart began to race. Eddie Mitchell. Could this be Ethan Riley, living under an assumed name? What can you tell me about him? Webb asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Like I said, quiet. Pays his rent on time. Doesn't cause trouble. Works some kind of computer job, I think. I see him leaving with a laptop bag most mornings. Seems nice enough, but he doesn't socialize much with the other tenants. Does he get visitors? Mail from family? Rosa shrugged. Not that I've noticed. Some packages from Amazon, but that's about it. He seems pretty isolated, actually. I've always wondered if he was running from something, an ex-wife, maybe, or debt problems. He has that look, you know, like he's trying to stay invisible. Webb felt the pieces clicking into place in his mind. A man living under a false name, keeping a low profile, avoiding social connections. It could describe someone who had been abducted as a child and was now trying to live a normal life without drawing attention to his past. Or it could describe any number of people with perfectly legitimate reasons for maintaining their privacy. Is he home now? Webb asked. Rosa glanced at her watch. Should be. He usually gets back from work around 6:30, and it's almost 7 now. But Detective Webb, was it? I can't just let you knock on his door. If you want to talk to him, you'll need to go through proper channels. Webb understood her position, but he also knew that proper channels could take weeks or months and might alert Eddie Mitchell, if that's who he really was, to the investigation. After 28 years of waiting, the idea of more delays was almost unbearable. I understand your concern, Webb said carefully, but this is a child who vanished without a trace in 1995. His mother has been searching for him for nearly 3 decades. If there's even a chance that Eddie Mitchell is that child, now grown up, don't you think he deserves to know that someone has been looking for him all this time? Rosa's expression softened slightly. Put it that way. Look, I can't let you into his apartment, but there's nothing stopping you from knocking on his door if you want to introduce yourself. What he does after that is his business. Webb climbed the narrow stairs to the 4th floor, his mind racing with possibilities. What would he say to someone who might be Ethan Riley? How do you approach a person who might not even know he was reported missing, might not remember his original identity? Apartment 4B was at the end of a dimly lit hallway. Webb stood outside the door for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the building around him. Televisions playing, someone cooking dinner, a couple having a muffled argument, normal sounds of people living normal lives. He raised his hand and knocked 3 times, firmly but not aggressively. Footsteps approached from inside the apartment, and then the voice that would change everything. Who is it? The voice was deeper than Ethan's had been as a 7-year-old, obviously, but there was something in the cadence, the slight Midwestern accent that made Webb's breath catch in his throat. Mr. Mitchell, my name is Marcus Webb. I'm a retired police detective, and I'm investigating a missing person case. I wonder if I could speak with you for a few minutes. There was a long silence from inside the apartment. Webb could almost feel the person on the other side of the door, thinking, weighing options, possibly preparing to flee. Finally, the voice came again, quieter this time. What kind of missing person case? The man who opened the door to apartment 4B was unmistakably the person from the photograph, but seeing him in person made the resemblance to Ethan Riley even more striking. He was of medium height with sandy hair that showed the same cowlick that had been prominent in the missing boy's school pictures. His pale blue eyes held a wariness that seemed deeply ingrained, the look of someone who had learned to be careful about trusting strangers. Eddie Mitchell? Webb asked, though he was already certain of the answer. The man nodded slowly, his hand still gripping the doorframe as if ready to close it at any moment. You said you're investigating a missing person case? I am. May I come in? This is a conversation that's probably better had in private. Eddie, if that was really his name, hesitated for a long moment, then stepped back to allow Webb into the apartment. The space was small but neat, furnished with the kind of inexpensive but functional furniture that suggested someone who moved frequently or didn't put down permanent roots. There were no family photographs visible, no personal mementos that might reveal anything about the occupant's past. "Can I see some identification?" Eddie asked, maintaining his position near the door. Webb handed over his retired police credentials and watched as Eddie examined them carefully. "These say you're retired, so this isn't an official investigation." "No, it's not. I'm here at the request of a family who has been searching for their missing son for 28 years. Webb pulled out his phone and showed Eddie the viral photograph. "This picture was taken 3 weeks ago, just down the street from here. It's been circulating online because of how closely you resemble someone who disappeared in 1995. Eddie stared at the photograph for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a mixture of fear and something that might have been relief. "Who do I supposedly resemble?" he asked quietly. Webb opened one of his case files and pulled out Ethan Riley's school photograph, the last picture taken before his disappearance. He placed it on the small coffee table between them, followed by the age progression images that had been created over the years. Eddie sat down heavily in a chair across from Webb, his eyes fixed on the photographs. For several minutes, the only sound in the apartment was the muffled noise of traffic on Lincoln Avenue below. "Ethan Riley," Eddie said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the name, isn't it?" Webb felt his heart skip a beat. "You recognize it?" Eddie was quiet for so long that Webb began to wonder if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. "I have fragments, memories that don't quite make sense. A county fair, the smell of cotton candy, a red balloon, a woman's voice calling a name that wasn't the name I grew up with." He looked up at Webb, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "For years, I thought they were just dreams, or maybe scenes from a movie I'd seen as a child. But looking at these pictures—" "Tell me about the name you grew up with," Webb said gently, his detective instincts warring with his desire to comfort someone who was clearly in distress. "Edward Michael Morrison. Eddie. I was told my parents died in a car accident when I was 7, and I went to live with my Uncle Frank in Wisconsin." "Frank Morrison." Eddie's voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting facts that had never quite felt real. "He was a quiet man, kept to himself, worked odd jobs, moved around a lot, always said it was better if we didn't get too attached to places or people." Webb felt the pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place. Frank Morrison. Did he ever mention having any connection to Millbrook County? "No, never, but—" Eddie paused, seeming to wrestle with a memory. "There was something about the way he reacted whenever missing children were mentioned on the news. He'd get agitated, change the channel quickly, and he never wanted me to have my picture taken. Said it was because he wanted to protect my privacy after losing my parents." The story was becoming clearer, and it was worse than Webb had imagined. Not a random stranger abduction, but someone who had systematically isolated a child from his real identity and family. Someone who had stolen 28 years of a family's life. "What happened to Frank Morrison?" Webb asked. "He died when I was 21. Heart attack. I found some paperwork after he passed, but nothing that really explained our history. A few documents with my name on them, but they all seem to start from when I was 7. Nothing from before that." Eddie looked directly at Webb. "I always wondered why I couldn't remember anything from my early childhood. Frank said it was trauma from losing my parents, that it was better not to try to remember." Webb reached for his phone. "I need to call someone. There's a woman in Millbrook who has spent the last 28 years wondering what happened to her son." She needs to know that you're alive." Eddie stood up abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked Lincoln Avenue. "Or what if I'm not who you think I am? What if this is all just a terrible coincidence? Then we'll deal with that when we come to it. But Eddie, looking at you, listening to you talk about these fragments of memory, I've been investigating this case for nearly 3 decades. You are Ethan Riley." The phone rang 3 times before Sarah answered, her voice carrying the cautious hope that had characterized every conversation since the photograph had surfaced. "Marcus. Sarah, I need you to sit down. I'm in Chicago and I've found him. I found Ethan." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Webb thought the call might have been dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without DNA confirmation. He's been living under the name Eddie Mitchell, but he has fragmented memories of his real childhood. Sarah, he remembers the county fair. He remembers a red balloon." Sarah's sob echoed through the phone, a sound that carried 28 years of grief and desperate hope. Can I talk to him?" Webb looked at Eddie, who was still standing by the window, his shoulders tense with the weight of revelations that were reshaping his entire understanding of his own life. "Eddie," Webb said softly, "there's someone who would very much like to speak with you. Your mother." Eddie turned from the window, his face pale but resolute. "What do I say to someone I don't remember?" "You say hello," Webb replied. "Everything else will come." As Webb handed Eddie the phone, he thought about all the cases he had worked over the years, all the families he had helped reunite or had to deliver terrible news to. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment, watching a lost child, now grown, take the first tentative step toward reclaiming a life that had been stolen from him. "Hello?" Eddie said into the phone, his voice shaking slightly. From across the room, Webb could hear Sarah's response, muffled by distance and emotion. "Ethan? Oh God, Ethan, is it really you?" And for the first time in 28 years, the question that had haunted a small town in Illinois finally had an answer. Ethan Riley had come home. The investigation would continue. There would be DNA tests to confirm identity, federal authorities to contact about the kidnapping, and a search for answers about Frank Morrison and how he had managed to steal and hide a child for so many years. But for now, in a small apartment in Chicago, a mother was talking to the son she thought she had lost forever, and a man was beginning to remember who he had always been. Outside the window, the lights of Chicago twinkled in the gathering darkness, and somewhere in that vast city, the truth was finally setting 2 people free from decades of pain and uncertainty. The case of the missing boy from the county fair was closed at last, not by the discovery of a crime scene or the arrest of a perpetrator, but by the sound of a voice saying, "Hello, Mom," for the first time in 28 years. Thank you for watching this incredible true story of loss, hope, and reunion. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you thought of Ethan's story. Have you ever wondered about cold cases in your own community? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads.